Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I would like to do one thing before diving into the subject under the title Harlow, Blake, and Decay, Anglophone Colonial History in the First Half of the 20th Century, Crisis, Diversity, and the Production of an Atlantic History. And that one thing is introducing myself. I come from the Brazilian backlands, from a place far away from here. But believe it or not, people used to call it the Brazilian Texas. My interest area is history of historiography. My first steps in this field were about African historians, which explain where I will begin my narrative later. Currently, I am studying the production of history during the first half of the 20th century by Black intellectuals with Ph.D. in history, a research which is founded by FAPESP, the São Paulo Research Foundation. As you see, this slide displays a line graphic generated by the Google and RUM viewer. The x-axis represents the timeline spanning from 1900 to 1950. Meanwhile, the y-axis measures the frequency at which the terms colonial historian and imperial historian occur with the corpus of books scanned by Google labeled English 2019. As we follow this line representing colonial historian in blue and imperial historian in red, we notice they move in opposite directions, indicating an inverse relationship in the usage in this period. Initially, the frequency of imperial historian dominates over colonial historians. However, around the first decade, this line crossed paths. Subsequently, colonial historian rise while imperial historian declines, particularly from the end of 1920. What could be behind this shift? That, folks, is the main question I try to answer this afternoon. Okay, in the academic year of 1915 to 1951, at King's College, University of London, the dissertation that later formed the basis of the book Trades and Politics was successfully presented. The candidate, Kenneth Onwuka-Dike, earned a PhD in history. In a short period, the mentioned book began to gain recognition for its pioneering nature, as Dike became a token of a now long-standing tradition of African historians in the modern sense, that is, professional historians. He had the guidance of two supervisors, whom he acknowledged in the preface of the first edition of Trades and Politics in 1956. They were Gerald Sanford Graham, then the Rhodes Professor of Imperial History at the University of London, and Vincent Todd Harlow, who also held the Rhodes chair. However, after 1945, he returns to his former institution, Oxford, where he became the Vice Professor of History of the British Empire, succeeding Sir Reginald Copeland. Taking into account the prestige of the Rhodes and Vice Professorships in the realm of British colonial history at that time, the case acknowledgement wasn't just a formality. By explicitly mentioning the position held by his mentors, the Key lent greater credibility to his debut book. If, on one hand, the fresh Ph.D. holder sought to showcase the endorsement of Graham and Harlow, I would like to suggest that the rise of the Key and other non-Western historians was seen as pivotal for the promotion of the field. Here we see the king in the center, the guest speaker, with who? Do you know? Someone want to guess who is the man beside the king? No one? Maybe you have Hoskowitz. Harlow, in a paper presented at the annual meeting of the British Historical Association in early 1948, undertakes the task of delineating recent trends in colonial history, an object already implicit in the title, recent research in colonial history since 1783. However, beyond simply outlining these trends, the author aims to assert the meaning of colonial history vis-a-vis the political and social predicaments of the post-war period. Harlow deliberately expressed this point of view, stating, I quote, "At a time when Western democracy is fighting for its life, we cannot afford, in teaching British history, which is the record of worldwide experiment in democracy, to distort it by being insular," unquote. In other words, Harlow argues that the teaching and research of colonial history are crucial both to challenge a narrow focus of British history and to counter threats to democracy around the world. In this context, the rise of the term colonial historian and the fall of the term imperial historian could be interpreted as a redefinition of their discipline in response to these pressing concerns. The redefinition of colonial research led by Harlow invites us to consider the current state of the field at the time through the emergence of a new generation. Such a generation, listen well, such generation presupposes more socio-economical, racial, and geographical, and one might add, gender-based innovations aimed on the body of research than just a change in age. Therefore, three key factors contribute to this generational shift. The first factor is the interwar experience, perceived as an overseas experience. Particularly for colonial history, this experience yielded a bunch of new researchers who were not directly involved in the colonial endeavor, indicating an expansion of social groups competing for the production of this history. Eventually, it's fair to suppose this broader participation appealed more to metropolitan public opinion and sensibility. In this slide, we can see the statue Demba y Dupont, erected in memory of Senegalese and French soldiers who fought in the First World War. I came across this monument while researching Julia Cooper's unpublished autobiography, The Third Step, and it is a very interesting illustration about how the colonial question was affected by the war experience. The second factor is the coming of those researchers identified by denegation, non-European, non-Westerner. About that, Harlow mentions Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, his former doctoral student at Oxford. His comments suggest a difficulty in classifying this book. Nevertheless, he spends more time contextualizing it, to then embrace the following observation. I quote, "It's encouraging to note that other non-European students from these islands are now coming to this country to undertake research into Caribbean history, unquote. Plus, Hallow now considering another group of researchers within the same identification adds a quote, a few Africans are doing likewise. And as institutions, university institutions developed at Ibadan, Achimota, etc., the flow may be expected to increase. Such studies of British administration by representatives of the communities concerned should be valuable and salutary, unquote. Finally, the third factor in characterizing this new generation and the consequent defense of a new history in which the field of colonial history is a model is the participation of women. In this context, women. In this context, Hallow merely mentions without apologetic comments, as he does with the non-Western researchers. Here, we found names such as Marjorie Perman, Lillian Marjorie Persson, and Evelyn Christina Martin, all English historians. However, with this remark, we can speculate important features about the field of colonial history. As Michael Bentley teaches, in the first half of the 20th century, I quote, women had only just begun to make an entry as university faculty, unquote. Thus, the field of colonial history seems to have been a less challenging role to take, given its marginalized status within the historical profession. Here are some about the position for Hallow from above. He was an authority, the idea of new generation, and a polemical, the last one is important, because I say that he has a moderate view of colonial history, because he defends a non-insular perspective of history, but still Western self-centering. And because of the implicit idea, what that I call division of scholarly labor, which ultimately means that the arrival of non-Western students was under surveillance, and the role they were supposed to play was that of informants. A year following Hallow's communication, in another relevant academic forum for British historians, a meeting of the Royal Historical Society, John William Blake revisited the issue of colonial history. However, there is now a greater emphasis on regional or tropical studies. Blake directs his attention especially towards the history of the West African coast. In doing so, he radicalized Hallow's proposal against an insular history, defending a historical perspective independent of metropolitan influence. On that embrace, I quote, history through African eyes and for its own sake, unquote. Therefore, there is a change from how Hallow frames the colonial history inquiry, as I quote, the history of the impact of Western civilization on both sides of the Atlantic upon the rest of the planet, unquote, to how Blake understands it, I quote, the reaction of native culture to alien culture, unquote. Speaking as a professor at the Queen's University Belfast, where he spent much of his career, Blake was situated outside the primary center of British intellectual history. such as the University of London, Oxford, and Cambridge. Despite that, his research journey closely mirrors the theme explored in the book that I initiate this narrative, Trades and Politics. In fact, Dike, the author of the book, was among those present at the Royal Historical Society meeting. Blake himself recounted this episode later, highlighting the enthusiastic reception from a young Nigerian scholar. So, in the Blake's view of colonial history, we also encounter the female contribution, including figures such as Sybil Airy Crowell, Tora Guinevere Stone, Flora Louise Shaw, the late Logard, and even an American woman historian, Elizabeth Donham. While Blake's methodological proposal advocates for an African historical perspective, he does not explicitly acknowledge the role of non-Western research in it. Nevertheless, he introduced a new line of inquiry within colonial history that was largely overlooked by Harlow, the transatlantic slave trade. Blake regards this theme as unavoidable for comprehending the modern history of the West African coast. Moreover, it is evident that understanding this theme requires international cooperation among historians. That's why Blake, for instance, cites a debate in the United States between Ulrich Phillips, a professor of American history at the University of Michigan, and the gentleman who appears beside the key in the previous picture, Heskovich, then an anthropologist at Northeast University. It's no coincidence that Dike, drawing on Blake, highlights his studies on transatlantic slave trade in the introduction of Trades and Politics. However, in this context, listing works by non-Western authors like The Suppression of African Slave Trade and Black Folk Then and Now by William Edward Booker Du Bois, The Black Jacobins by Cyril Lionel Robert James, The previously mentioned Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, and Africa and the Rise of Capitalism by Wilson L. Williams. I suggest that Dike, by doing this, formulate his own reading of the communication of Harlow and Blake. He combines what one could only analyze from a moderate and sociological perspective, and the other from a methodological standpoint. Indeed, the reference to the aforementioned books is accompanied by the following comment. I quote, "The part played by African colonialists, the building of the new world is now being acknowledged," unquote. This sets forth as a specific agenda for non-Western on both sides of the Atlantic, since Dike takes as his own subject, I quote, "the position of power occupied by the African middlemen in the period of the slave trade," unquote. He, in a clear endorsement of Eric Williams' thesis, further asserts, now pointing to the old world, I quote, "It is now known that the triangular trade, the trade between Britain, West Africa, and the West Indies, provide one of the many streams from which emerged the capital that financed the Industrial Revolution." To sum up, the rise of the term colonial historian and the decline of imperial historian by the end of the 1920s provide valuable insights into how colonial history production changed during the Western crisis. The witness of different actors, Harlow, Blake, and Dike, involved in it, allow us to have a glimpse of a new approach to understand the past. Particularly with Dike, there is a view of historiography aimed at explaining social historical process with the complex relationship among Africa, the New World, and the Old World. I propose that this is an agenda of historical production, which could be characterized as an early form of historiography of the Atlantic, Black Atlantic in professional history. In other words, it represents a relative independent current of non-Western historians that dare to disobey the control of the division of scholarly labor as we saw in Harvard communication. Two key aspects require further clarification, indicating the direction of the ongoing research. First, I argue that these non-Western historians should be categorized by the self-affirmative term of the day, colored people. Second, the historiography represents this historiography represents a distinct trend within colonial history that challenge usual notions of modernity more than the colonialism itself. This assertion is something I intend to explore further, drawing from the experience of figures like Julia Cooper, Du Bois, and Eric Williams, and their respective works, including L'attitude de la France à l'égard de l'esclavage pendant la Révolution, Black Reconstruction in America, and Capitalism and Slavery. That was the work I cited. That is my background, the arts in my background. That is my non-institutional alma mater that in this very year is celebrating 20 years, and I want to dedicate this for them, for us. Thank you.